Do you want to get some more?
I don't want to get some coffee because I just hit
No,
record
because you hit record. I
right
got
in the
the
middle when
message,
you were talking.
as
Ev-
always.
Every time. I didn't do it on purpose that time, though.
Yeah. Oh, so you have been doing it on purpose this whole time. Are
No,
you
that's not what I meant
conversating
to
and cutting it
say.
off?
That wasn't it at all. Welcome to the podcast, everybody.
Hi,
Uh,
listeners. Yes, it's Jeff and me again, right in the middle of what does Faye call it? Fighting.
Fighting, bickering. Are we bickering? Um, we're not bickering.
No. And to
Uh,
be fair, we have spent 3 full days. Well, I guess just 2 full days
2 full days together, but they
together.
felt like 3. Because work was hard. That came out sounding like something was. They felt one day with you feels like 3. I was just kidding. I don't mean that. It was because work was tough. This week. So yeah, so this is a Q&A episode. We haven't done one of these since January 3rd.
Wow.
So we're like a good, 2 months.
Only February 17th.
We're like a good month and 14 days. I did maths. Month and 14 days from doing one of these. So it's not that far. That's not actually even that big a deal. I feel like I've set us up for something that
I feel like we were doing them once every 4 weeks before.
We were doing them once every 4, which is we're like right on track too. So I don't know why I'm making a big deal of when the last time we did one was. Just gonna keep digging myself into this hole. Here we go. It's getting deeper and deeper. Okay, so we're doing a Q&A, and but before we get to the Q&A, let's talk about the thing that's coming up on February 26th from 12 to 4 Eastern Standard Time. 12 to 4:30 Eastern Standard Time. Because we are doing a conference, and it is a brand new conference, one that we've never done before, that's going to work you through a blank page to a completed scene that is dialogue centric. So come to our conference. It's going to be great. It's on Zoom. If you can't attend the day of, you can still sign up, and we'll send you a recording of it afterwards. To sign up, go to dialoggedoctor.com, go to the menu and click on Workshops 2022, and it'll be in there. And we'll talk more about it in a minute, but I just wanted to start off the top and be like, hey, by the way, we have this thing coming up in 10 days that you should go sign up for. It's going to be awesome. Yeah. Anything else you want to say about it off the top?
No, I'm just really excited about this one. I mean, I was excited about the last one too, because the other one that we run is really like voice focused. And when you get me talking about how a character's voice should sound, I can really like just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and have this idea and that idea and whatever. This one's a little bit different. This is about writing and editing to really focus your dialogue into that emotional action for your readers, which, as any of my book coaching clients will say, I get really passionate about that too.
That's awesome.
I really just like the emotional journey of things.
Yeah.
Which is really funny because in my real life, I try to avoid the emotional journey at all costs.
You save it all for your fiction. That's what it is. You're storing it all up. You're stuffing it all deep down so that it can all come out in fiction. Yeah, so go sign up for that. It's going to be a really fun conference. We're going to have a really great time. We're going to start, you're going to see us build a scene from 0 to finish, and we're going to talk tips and tricks along the way. Yeah, so dialoggedoctor.com, click on the menu, find Workshops 2022, and sign up for that. Okay, so Q&A time. How are you? Let's start there.
I'm good. How are you?
I'm tired.
Yeah. Well, I did take a nap. I find that at the end of the day in our day job, I just come home just exhausted because we're in that like finishing production stage of things, which I would translate for writing a book in that like final editing stage, where it's like you've put all of this effort and energy into getting to a finished product, but there's still so much more work to do.
Yeah, I would actually think of it as like the final chapters of the first draft.
Mm,
The final chapters of the first draft always feel like you've accomplished something huge, but you actually have so much work still to do. You're always like, oh, it's so exhausting. I left it all on the page. It's all there. And now I have to read the entire book again. It's always this
yeah.
like, yeah, big, oh, yeah. Anyway. Um, yeah.
How
So
are
you got a
you?
nap, is what you were saying.
I did. I did
Yeah.
get a nap.
Nice. I did not get a nap. I came home.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I picked my daughter from basketball practice, made dinner, put a kid to bed. My wife had a work meeting tonight, put a kid to bed. So that's why I did all of this stuff myself. Usually we tag team it, put a kid to bed, and then made dinner for tomorrow. So like I've been
Nice.
busy. Yeah.
Nice. What are you having tomorrow?
We are doing a Korean inspired beef stew.
Nice.
Yeah, which is going to be fun. So
Nice.
we'll see. Korean flavors in a beef stew. It's going to be great. My kids are going to love it. They're going to eat so much of it. They're not going to eat any of it at all. But I'm going to eat it and I'm going to like it. I stopped cooking for them a long time ago. Okay, so because I always, unless it's like mac and cheese, I lose. Okay, so that's how we are. We asked the dialoggers in the Dialogue Doctor Patreon / Slack channel. We asked the dialoggers for questions tonight, and they hit us with 7 great questions. So, first question: what are you reading and writing right now?
You want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. I just finished my latest novel. I put the I wrote. Well, okay. Let's go back to our earlier question. I just finished the first draft of my latest novel. I wrote the last chapter last week. It is 122,000 words, so it is twice as long as any other novel I've written, which is some nonsense.
Okay, wait till your editor gets a hold of it. It'll be 35,000 words.
That's right. Cut. So yeah, I did that. So I'm transitioning out of that. And I don't know about other people, but I get to this place after I finish a book. I'll start like walking around in the world because there's all these like themes. There's always themes in it that feel unfinished. Like, oh, I was kind of teasing at something here, and I don't know that I actually got it. Like I spoke to it, but I don't know that I got it where I wanted to get it. And then I'll be like, what? Like today, I was listening to a podcast, and I heard the podcaster say, it was a podcast on racial reconciliation, and I heard the podcaster say something, and I was like, oh crap, that's the theme I was trying to hit that I couldn't find. So I went this morning, I went and rewrote a little chapter, the end of a chapter, because that's just how it works. So I will be writing that probably for the next month. I'll be doing that. I'll be fleshing out themes that like a paragraph here. It's never like a full chapter. It's always like, oh, if I change this paragraph here, that can bring this better to light. Or like if I move, oh, I have this conversation with these people and I remember I ended it in X way, but if I go back and give them like 2 more exchanges, I can really land that theme differently. So it's that kind of stuff. So I'll be doing that. I started outlining my next novel, because when you finish one book, you start the next one. That's the job. Start outlining my next novel. It is going to be a rom-com set post-pandemic that revolves around a treasure hunt. That's my next one, which I'm excited about. And both people are seeing the same therapist, and they're both having hallucinations. So that's my next one. So I started playing with that, and then I also started digging out some nonfiction stuff that we're working on. I started playing with that too. So that's what I'm writing. What about you? What are you reading?
Currently nothing.
Nice.
I am supposed to be reading a couple of journal articles to finish my thesis.
Nice.
So yeah, that is my big weekend project. I will be reading at least 3 journal articles. I will be writing my proposal, and I am working on another journal article collaboration on a work project.
Amazing.
So those are my big writing goals right now.
Yeah.
I also need to figure out what our book club book is and get
It's right here.
that.
That's what I'm reading. The Network Effect.
Network Effect. Okay.
It's great. Don't worry. I won't schedule it until mid-March so that you have time to read it. Late March.
Well, I never start the book until you set the date.
Until I set the date. Do you want me to set the date?
Not yet.
It's an amazing book. I'm about halfway through it. I'm very excited about it.
Nice.
Yeah. I'm also reading the Liar's Poker, which is a nonfiction book that I'm always reading a nonfiction and a fiction book at the same time. It's a nonfiction book by my favorite author, whose name I suddenly cannot remember, which is bad. I can hear his voice in my head because he also has a podcast, but I cannot remember his name so I'm looking it up right now. Michael Lewis. Thank you. It's by Michael Lewis, who's my favorite nonfiction.
You told me about it yesterday.
Yeah, I know. I was talking about it yesterday. Yeah, but I'm reading that one as well. Liar's Poker and The Network Effect, a murder bot novel by Martha Wells. Yeah. Anyway,
all right.
Those are the two things I'm reading. Anything you besides The Network Effect? Anything on your stack to read for fun?
So when I read for fun, when I have time to read for fun, I scroll through my list of authors that I read, and I check to see if they have anything new. But I haven't really had a ton of free time, so I haven't had a chance to look to see what they wrote recently,
Nice.
published recently. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
I started Emily Oliphant, I think is the name of it. It was just okay. It's really beautifully written, but I couldn't sink to it. For me, it was a case of a protagonist that I couldn't get into. I wasn't there. Yeah. It's a lot of her wandering around complaining about how people treat her. It was just like, I can see that it's going somewhere, but I just couldn't go with it. Yeah. Okay. Anything else we want to say about what we're reading and writing right now?
No, I think we covered that pretty well.
Okay. Yeah. If you want to fight me about whether Emily Oliphant is a great book or not, feel free to send me emails. I read and respond to all emails. Okay. Question number 2. What? And if you're like, Jeff, you're stupid, it's a great book, I'll probably be like, yeah, you're right. Question number 2. I'm terrible to fight with. What would you say are 5 authors, or at least 5 stories, that you recommend for learning dialogue and story together?
This is a really hard one for me. I feel like you're better at this. I feel like you read to understand writing.
Oh, yeah.
I read to enjoy the story. And I've talked to you about this before. When I first started editing for you, I was like literally just grammar editing. But I would find that there were like the start of the chapter would have a lot of notes and the ends wouldn't have any, because I'd get lost in the story. And then I forget all the like, what do you need?
Yeah. Hashtag Jeff is winning. That's what that is. Hashtag Jeff is. That's my favorite. If I can make an editor like get lost in the chapter, I'm like, I've won.
Yeah.
But then I haven't won because they've stopped leaving me edits. So it's really a win-lose situation.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I think you need to find a proofreader, not an editor.
I have a proofreader this next novel, which is nice.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
I'm excited about that.
I'm gonna send it off to the grammar editor. Anyway. Yeah, so you can't do you have 5 off the top of your head?
Not off the top of my head. I have to think about it.
Okay, I've got 5 off the top of my head.
Okay. Give me your 5 and I will.
So I had to struggle with, and you're right, you and I are different, because like they're like, name 5. I'm like, okay, I've got 10.
You have 25.
How do I narrow them down? And so I was like, all right, I'm gonna list books that people are actually gonna read, because like I have a bunch of books on my list that like I could throw, like Infinite Jest is fantastic for learning dialogue. Don't read that. Um,
I feel like the author of Infinite Jest is like giving you money for
from the Beyond the Grave,
promoting
because he's
his
dead.
book.
That's
Well,
right.
his estate, I didn't know he was dead, whatever, because I feel like we always talk about that book. I
I
know.
know. I bring it
The
up
only
just to
one
see
that's
your face when I
title I
say it.
can read.
Yeah, y'all, I've strategically positioned it behind me on my shelf so that when I do this, Laura can see it. I do just to tease you. So okay, so 5 that I think people will actually read. Number 1 is Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice has amazing dialogue, and it is the basis for all romance novels. So if you want to see how dialogue works in a romance novel, Pride and Prejudice is your thing. And here's the problem, is that like I used to pick the books for book clubs, so several of them I'm gonna list. I've forced people to read already. Beloved by Toni Morrison. Gotta read it to know dialogue. Amazing dialogue in a horror story. Fantastic build of emotion when in her dialogue, like really amazing way to communicate emotion in dialogue. Newcomer to my list is The House on the Cerulean Sea.
I was going to put that one in.
Yeah, best like big cast book I've read in a long time. I'm really excited about reading his other one, the Under the Whispering Door. That's on my to read list. If you're into fantasy and you want fantasy dialogue, Game of Thrones, the first book of the Fire and Ice saga by George R.R. Martin, has exquisite dialogue. I don't talk about it enough, but
So I don't think you're answering the question that's asked. The
what
question asked was recommend for learning dialogue and story together. Like I could list 5 books that I love dialogue in. That's
I thought it meant together as in like a group of people.
no, they meant like what stories balance the story and the dialogue. Like how does, I'm assuming it's more like learning dialogue and story together.
Learning dialogue, so like learning them at the same time.
Yeah.
Oh, well, don't read George R.R. Martin, because that man, I mean, he's great at like long lasting plots that go forever, but he doesn't keep track of them well, and they tend to just disappear.
Yes.
Yeah. So I stand by Beloved, Pride and Prejudice, and House on the Cerulean Sea to learn story and thing together. And I actually like those answers because they're different genres of book. And you got to do Pride and Prejudice because it is the basis for all romance novels. So
I've never read it.
Really? I mean, you just don't. You've seen it in every Hallmark movie.
Well, okay, yeah, but I've never read Jane Austen.
Pride and Prejudice is shockingly short. You can read it. It's shockingly short. You can read it really quickly.
I could, but
it's really entertaining. Sure, there is a long letter in the middle that I know you will just skip.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So I have this like picture in my mind, and it's terrible, that Jane Austen and Tolstoy have the same writing style. I read Anna Karenina. Well, that's not true. I read the first half of Anna Karenina, and like 3 pages on what the train looks like, and I'm like, I can't.
That is, yeah, they are in no way similar.
So maybe I've been shortchanging.
Yeah, I don't know that they're in no way similar. They are similar. I don't know. We need an English professor to talk about that. I don't see them in the same. I've read a lot of Tolstoy. I don't see them in the same.
I don't know why they're paired together in my head. They shouldn't. One's like romance and the other's like Russian lit.
Yeah, I mean, Tolstoy is like, I'm gonna beat you over the head with tragedy and sadness until you finally surrender and drink vodka. Yeah, that's really funny. Yeah, I think maybe I would connect them in my mind because when people make movies of them, the movies always feel the same. They're kind of the same, like,
I think that's why they're connected in my head.
Yeah.
So,
but they're very different writers. Okay, so yeah, man, I got to cross Game of Thrones off. I'll stick by my fifth choice too, which was The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. It's a little short book.
You
Um,
do love that.
I do love it,
You
and the
say it
reason,
all
one
the
of the reasons I
time.
love it is because it's one of the first novels I read that made me notice dialogue. And
Mm,
this was back when I was like in college, because it is just a series of conversations that the main character is listening in on. He's just eavesdropping on these conversations between these people. And the plot and it's kind of a theology book. It's a weird cross between, like, it's almost like he wanted to write a theology book, and then he was like, if I write this, nobody's going to read it, I'll write this story. But then the story kind of took over, and then it just like became the story. So
I
it's
feel
that.
like a lot of Lewis's work is like,
And a lot of his work is like that. Yeah. So I do recommend that for learning story and dialogue, because he carries full, you have you have encounters between two characters, you know nothing about them, and you learn about their relationship and their backstory through their conversation. And there are big emotional twists in every conversation. Every conversation ends differently than you think it's going to.
mhm,
Um, so yeah, that's a really good one to read if you're going to learn dialogue and story together, and it's a short one to read.
okay.
Um, yeah, what do you have any that come to mind?
I do. And I'm going to change the question a little bit because I don't think about story the way that writers think about story, because I am not a writer. I am a reader and I am an editor. So I'm going to change the question just a little bit. It answers the question, but it's like parallel to it. So the way I'd phrase the question is, what books would I recommend for understanding how dialogue and story can link together to take your reader on an emotional journey? So it's like learning it, but it's learning it from the reader's perspective as opposed to the writer's perspective. I don't know that I can point to the writers specifically and be like, well, I really liked it when they did this plot point or when they did this dialogue, but I remember like there's stories that I had an emotional response to
Hmm.
because I loved the characters.
Hmm.
So my go-to is always going to be To Kill a Mockingbird, because the characters come to life so much and it's their conversations that really move the story and the plot along. So, and anyone who attended our first conference knows that I am like obsessed with the book. I know it all front to back and back to front. That's not true. I forget stuff all the time. But I would definitely say that one. I'm going to echo Beloved and The House on the Cerulean Sea that you already said, but I don't need to go back to those. I would also say that Sounds Like Crazy by Shana McAfee. Mahaffey. I don't know
I
how
haven't
you.
read that one.
Yeah. So it's about a woman who has multiple personalities, dissociative identity disorder, if we're using the new proper terminology. And what I love about it is that each personality has its own voice and they talk to each other. So you're seeing this woman process her life and her trauma through the eyes of the multiple personalities who have different roles in her protection.
Interesting.
Um, but the voices are really great. And I read it a long time ago before we started the Dialogue Doctor. So before I really like started thinking about how dialogue is crafted.
Mm-hmm.
But I just remember reading it, and I should go back and reread it again now that we've got like the dialogue look on things. But without the difference in the voices and who the different characters are, it would be really hard to see the same story. So
Hmm.
I'm definitely going to recommend that.
Nice.
Um, and then the other one, sorry, I'm looking up the author.
You're good. I've got another one while you look it up.
Okay.
We have a lot of memoir writers that listen to this podcast, and
Mhm.
I've been asked a few times, like, how do I include dialogue in memoir? Since I'm reading a Michael Lewis book, it brings it to mind. Michael Lewis does this really, really well. So any of his are good for that. Liar's Poker is his first one. The Big Short, Moneyball. He's got two other ones. One's about a personality test that's really great. But what he does in there, because the problem memoir writers always have is like, I don't have the exact dialogue that's said. So Lewis does this really great thing where he's like, and she told me about blah, 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 blah. And she said, and then he'll put like the two words that really stand out that he remembers in quotations. So it's like this summarizing, but like an intimate summary of dialogue where he's like describing what the person's talking about, just not directly quoting them, but then giving the direct quote to the thing that he remembers. So it's a really great way to do dialogue in a memoir. And his memoir chapters, I would say, I mean, I haven't taken out my highlighter and actually analyzed them, but I'd say they're about 50% dialogue still, even in a memoir, which is probably why I find him so engaging. But yeah, that's mine. And he's an excellent storyteller. He sets up a really strong conflict at the beginning of every chapter. There's always kind of like a question about that he's going to answer with the story he's telling. And then there's an overarching question that he's answering with all of his books, because like, you know, like with Liar's Poker, it's about what was Wall Street like in the boom of the 80s, and then what happened to it. Like, why did it fall apart? And that's his overarching theme. And then each chapter, he kind of dissects the culture and the problems around it. So it's a really good, he's great for if you're writing memoir, for understanding the story in memoir.
Nice.
Did you find the one you were looking for?
I did, yes. The book is Symptoms of Being Human, and it's by Jeff Garvin. And I've talked about it on this podcast before. It's about, and it's young adult fiction. It's about a teen, Riley Kavanaugh, who is trying to understand their own gender identity in the world of the binary, because they identify as gender fluid. And it's about their story of coming out and understanding the world and the world understanding them. And again, I read it before we did the Dialogue Doctor, but I remember reading the conversations that Riley has with their parents and really like feeling the emotional intensity of being in this moment, the push and the pull of the parents' emotions, Riley's emotion, and just like this conflict that's constantly happening. Definitely one that I would say, and again, with the question being learning dialogue and story together, without the dialogue, the story wouldn't move or have the emotional component to it. So that would be my number 5.
Nice. Hey, good job, us. We came up with a lot of books. Okay, question number 3. As an editor, dun dun dun, when you run across a client who has monomouth, what's the first thing you recommend they do to distinguish their characters?
Well, I mean, this is an easy one. They talk to us about using, or just go to our website and grab
they sign up for a coaching session. Nice.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't going to go with coaching session. I was going to go with the free tools, but the coaching session.
Free tools. Yeah. You sign up for free tools. Yeah, that's what I meant to say.
Yeah. So I really think that monomouth happens naturally for writers, because when they're writing, they have this story in their head and they want to get it out, and they're telling the story from their perspective, which means the characters sound like them. That's in my opinion, that's where monomouth comes from. It tends to be the writer's voice that's coming out of the character's mouth. So going back to the basics and really understanding who your characters are and what makes them who they are, and then going and building your words, pacing, cadence, and body language to figure out how your character should express themselves, and then edit from that perspective. So really going back to the character is my answer.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have a different answer than that. The first question I tend to ask writers struggling with monomouth is, what does this personality sound like? Because I know writers can get lost. Like we break, some of us love the breakdown of the words, body language, cadence, and pacing, and then some of us get very overwhelmed by it because they're like, oh my gosh, that's too much. I've got 5 characters. That's too much to think about for all of them. I found myself, especially recently, telling writers like latch onto one for each character. Either have like very strong understanding of the words they use or their body language or their cadence or their pacing, and the other 3 will follow. If you can find one that you latch onto, it can get you started. But the question I tend to ask is, okay, so describe for me the personality and how does it sound? What does that sound like in a room? That'll usually help people distinguish characters. Writing the characters is, like you're saying, Laura, is different because typically there's 2 things happening. One is that what you're talking about is like they're so consumed in the story they're not actually thinking about what the characters sound like. The other problem is that they're just not used to writing voice, so they don't know when they're all their voices are starting to sound the same. Usually chapters start off really well, and then about 2/3 of the way through the chapter, all the characters sound the same. So if you want to see if you're doing that, don't read the first of your chapter, skip to the 3rd of your chapter and look down there.
The other thing I tell writers a lot is not to panic. Identifying the fact that their characters have monomouth is half the battle. Once you can start to see that they all sound the same, changing them is easy. The other thing I tell them is until you get latched on to the voices and you start to hear the voices in your head or they're speaking through your mouth, depending on which perspective you take as a writer, changing from monomouth to whatever the opposite of monomouth is, individual mouth.
Dynamic character voices.
Right, dynamic character voices. Yeah, I knew you'd have language for that. That's an editing thing until you learn the voices. So when you're writing, just get your story out. You can edit that as you're moving from your dialogue only draft to your full scene draft. And we can give you some tips for that. And I think we probably will.
At the workshop on the 26th, we can give you some tips for that.
I think probably that's what we're going to talk about.
That's probably what we're going to talk about. Okay, question number 4. First person narrative. Is it actual dialogue? How do we feel, and what are the ramifications of that?
So I got to be honest on this one. As a reader, I don't really pay attention to what voice or point of view a book is in, except if it's done really poorly, in which case I just stop reading, or if it's done really, really well.
So when you say you don't pay attention, you don't mean you don't notice. You mean you don't care as long as it's done
I don't
well.
notice.
Oh, that's
when I engage in the story, I don't care how the storyteller is telling me the story if I'm engaged in it. And again, a lot of this is that lazy reader syndrome that I have, where it's like, it doesn't matter how the story is being told. I just want to be there for the story. So I probably could not tell you, save for 4 or 5 books I've ever read, what point of view the book was in. As I was Googling symptoms of being human, I saw a page or 2 and I realized it's written in first person point of view, where the person is literally just kind of narrating their day.
That's interesting.
I had no idea, right? Like, that's not how I connect to the story. I know from a writer's perspective, it's a big decision that you're making, but as a reader, it does not impact me one way or the other.
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of reader you are as well. It's actually really important for genre readers. So romance readers expect a certain point of view. Sci-fi readers expect a certain point of view. Like, so, part of the decision of what point of view to use comes down to who your readers are, because
I think that's fair.
And point of view is super important to me. Actually, it's one of the first things I look at in a novel. network effect was, and I've been doing that long before I was a writer. Like if I didn't connect, if you're writing first person point of view and I can't connect to your voice, like I don't care about, that's what, like I said, I was struggling with the book Emily Oliphant. That's why I'm struggling. I don't, it's a first person point of view and I'm struggling to connect with that voice. So that being said, I would say that yes, your first person narrative is dialogue. And so we're not talking about, I actually asked the questioner, Tom. I asked Tom, I was like, describe this question a little bit more. And he was like, so if you've got a book where there's a lot of first person narration, but it's not in quotes, is that dialogue? Or it's not like inner thoughts weaved into a third person point of view. It is actually true first person point of view. And the reason I want writers to think of it as dialogue is because that character needs a specific voice, and that voice needs to modulate depending on how the narrator feels. Part of that is shaped by, like, is it present narration where the narrator is talking about things as they happen, or is it past narration where the narrator is telling you a story about something that happened? So like, the one that always comes to mind is Elizabeth Gilbert's books. A lot of her novels are written in past narration where she's telling you about things that have happened and the narrator already knows how the story is going to end. So that in that, you want to, there's not going to be as much voice modulation because the narrator feels about the story how the narrator feels about the story. If you're doing present first person point of view, like The Book Thief, where Death is narrating the story and he's telling you the story as he's watching it, his voice modulates, and you hear Death differently in different sections. It's been a while since I read that book. I should probably pick it back up before I say that, but my memory of it is that way. So I would say, yeah, it does matter. It does matter that you think of it as dialogue, mostly because you need to know that that point of view has an emotional tenor to it. And part of the emotional journey is going to be modulating that narrator's voice. And that voice needs to stand out from the other voices in the book, right? Like the worst thing you can do is have all of your characters also sound like your narrator. That's not a positive thing. But in writing first person is tricky because your narrator also has to be a vehicle that people want to get in. So like if you're going to write first person, they're going to spend a lot of time hanging out in that character's world. And so they've got to be somebody your reader enjoys being with, which I think goes to what you were saying, Laura, is that like, as long as you enjoy it, you'll stick with it. You'll stick with the book.
Well, and it's funny because as you were talking, I was looking up Sounds Like Crazy because Symptoms of Being Human was first person. Sounds Like Crazy is also first person. I think it's, and what you were saying about it being a genre thing, I think is probably true. But I tend not to be, well, when I have time to read and I can just pick up any book and read it, I tend not to be a genre reader. When I'm limited on time and I know that I'm only going to be able to read one book in the next 6 weeks, I'm going to pick something that I just gravitate toward, which, like I said, is like one of my top 4 writers.
Yeah. So. I was talking to Chris Kane about this recently on a bonus episode. She and I started discussing like when to use first person and when not to. And part of something she said, that she's a romance writer in a former life, and part of which I don't think she considers herself that anymore, but she's got 42 novels in romance, so she kind of is. But she was talking about how the reason romance is often in first person is because it's like a direct line into the emotional experience of the character, right? Like first person POV is a shortcut into the emotional experience of the character because you're in the character's head. So like you can just get that direct line into how they're feeling about things, which makes the modulation of a voice really important. in that narration, but at the same time, I feel like that's the advantage to it, is that you really engage deeply with that character voice. And so it amplifies the emotional experience for the reader in some ways.
Yeah.
All right, question number 5. I'm writing a character who speaks formally, but she's duplicitous. And when she's using made up drug post-apoc, her speech changes completely. Is this realistic, or am I going off the deep end?
I love this question. Do you want to answer first? I feel
No,
like
you can answer first. If you love it,
Are
go
you
for
sure?
it. Yeah.
Okay, I feel like I answered the last couple first. So the answer is very solidly, it depends.
Worst answer ever. Sorry, keep going.
So speech changing completely can happen, especially if the reason is because of drugs, right? Like it can happen. But my recommendation is to understand who the character is and what about the core of their character is showing such difference in the voice, and really understanding what point of the voice is changing. Is she going from formal to informal? Is she going from like angry and outwardly focused to sullen and inwardly focused? Like understanding how the differences work as it relates to the personality can actually be a wonderful thing. It can reveal a ton to the reader. But on the flip side, if you're just creating different voices because you want different voices and there's no link or there's no realistic experience for the user, then yes, you could be going off the deep end. But I think it can be done right and done really well as long as there's an understanding and an explanation. But characters talking very differently, and this idea of like formal and informal, all it is code switching, right? And people do this all the time. Someone who spends their time in a really formal workplace, but has a really informal home life, they're going to code switch, and their dialogue is going to change differently based off of the world that they're in. So I actually think it can be a really wonderful thing if the reason that it's being done is thought through and created appropriately. So that's my answer.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is because a drug is involved, you need to make sure the rules of the drug are consistent through the book. So that doesn't mean the drug has to have the same impact on each person that takes it, but it means that the drug's impact needs to be defined and then interpreted through how those. So there needs to be a reason one character responds this way and another character responds this way. Drugs in a book are like magic. They need rules. You can't just throw them in there.
Love your rules.
I love my rules. You gotta have world rules. You
have to have rules for your
it's all just the same. It's actually they're all just rules of your world. Like your world has to make sense.
No, and it's true. I love it. I make fun of you for saying it all the time, but I actually feel the same way, right? Like if you don't have that structure, that's where your readers feel like this doesn't make any sense. So.
Yeah, and it becomes this weird thing of like, oh, the author's just kind of using this to do whatever they want to do, and it doesn't make sense anymore. And so just make sure that like Laura was saying, you need to know the character, you need to know why and how that voice is changing. That needs to be consistent through the story. Is it a Jekyll and Hyde where like the drug is making a completely different person? Then yes, you should 100% be changing that voice. Is it pot where it's just mellowing them out? Well, then it's probably not a voice change, it's probably just a modulation a little bit, like so thinking about what the what the rules are around that drug, I think is going to be the key to answering that question. But the importance is consistency. It's got to be consistent through the book. Anything else to say about that one?
No, I think we knocked that one out of the park really fast. Have rules and understand them.
I always feel like these go for like, you and I just start talking. We're like 4 hours later, we're on question number 3. Okay, number 6.
Yeah, but then 4 hours and 6 minutes later, we're done the rest of them.
That's true. We finish everything else. Oh, we're done. Okay, number 6. Tips on dialogues with pets and objects where it is spoken aloud, but it is a one-sided conversation. So this is really just a question about any one-sided conversation. But tips on pets and objects.
So we are really singing praises for the house by the Cerulean Sea, or the house in the Cerulean Sea.
Yeah.
The main character, Linus, has a cat.
Mhm.
And Linus talks to his cat all of the time. And the thing about dialogue with a pet or an object is people speak to pets and objects because they're actually having a conversation. And while verbally the conversation is one-sided, the conversation actually is not one-sided. So in the house in the Cerulean Sea, the cat is actually participating in the conversation. Now, that's a little harder to do with an inanimate object. With an inanimate object, you're actually taking the character's voice and you are putting that another side of that voice on the object.
Yeah, you just have to personify the object.
Right.
Yeah, the toaster has to glare at him.
Right.
You know, toasters don't actually glare, but like you're saying, the characters has to in some way be imagining the inanimate object's responses.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I would argue that the cat does actually sit in judgment because
an animal's different because an animal actually physically responds. Yeah. And that's the key, is that, remembering that, part of the reason we qualify body language as part of dialogue is because, if we go to the philosophical core of what dialogue is, it's an exchange of expectations and emotions between two things. So
you got to say that again, because that was really insightful.
It's really funny. I would always surprises me when somebody's like, "That's insightful." I'm like, "Really?" So if you go to the core, this is something I think a lot about late at night, at like 2:00 in the morning. If you go to like the root of what dialogue is, right? It's not people talking. Dialogue is the exchange of emotions and expectations between two parties. So the reason I'm saying emotions is because when we communicate, what we're communicating is like, hey, this is how I feel. And expectations get to that base need of like, this is what I need / want in this conversation. So you're talking about wants, needs, and how I feel about them. It's the exchange of those things. So when someone is talking to a pet, that exchange, even if we go like philosophically, we're like, well, does the dog actually feel that, or is the person projecting that feeling onto the dog? It doesn't matter. So it does, but it doesn't. So now it doesn't necessarily do your story, unless your story is about the person personifying things, which is actually the romance novel I'm thinking about writing. Anyway, so I'm down a rabbit trail. So all that to say, bring it back. Reel it back in. Come on back. So when you write the utterances between the character and the inanimate object or the pet, you want the character, and this is why Laura's example is so fantastic, is because TJ Klune does this. You want the character to speak, and then you want the pet to respond, just as if the pet were speaking, but the pet is going to use body language instead of actual words and quotations. And then you want the character to speak, and then you want the pet to respond. You're writing an exchange of emotions and expectations between two things. And when you're doing it with an inanimate object, like I wrote a short story once in which a guy was talking to his cigar smoke. So he's talking, he blows smoke in the air and it makes a picture, and he comments on the picture, and then the smoke changes and makes another picture and he comments on that picture. So, but that inanimate object of smoke is an utterance that I am personifying with expectations and emotions in order to further the story. This is a really great technique if you have a lone wolf character. If you've got a character that's always by themselves, having them talk to something, their horse in a Western or a fantasy, their sword in a fantasy, their blaster in a sci-fi, I would say don't try not to have those characters by themselves. But if you have to have them by themselves all the time, having them talk to an inanimate object and having the object provide them with security, or like feel, they can hold the gun and it feels a certain way. That feeling they're getting from the gun is that exchange of expectation and emotion. So it's, that was a really long-winded answer for pets talk back.
Yeah, but I think you said something really important there. Not the insightful part, because
one out of 15 things you just said was really important.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. Like, there's the insightful part about the exchanging of wants, needs, and expectation between two characters. I think that's really great. But I think that the key that I think writers need to hear is, if your character doesn't have to be alone, like have to, they're on a journey by themselves, you as the writer are in charge.
Yeah.
If this person is locked in a dungeon, oh, guess what? Someone else can be locked in the dungeon longer than them. I mean, Dumas did an entire book about someone locked in the first half of the book, right? Yeah. Like The Count of Monte Cristo would have been a very different book had there not been someone locked in the cell next to him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we just worked with a writer. If you want to read a contemporary writer who's doing this, who I think is doing this really innovatively and well, one of the first authors we worked with was Sherry Deckerhurst, who is writing a series, a historical fiction series about bootleggers, and her books that are coming out this month. She and I were originally working on some scenes, and her character is always alone. Oh, she's a moonshiner. She's always by herself. She's in her truck a lot alone. And I was reading these chapters and I was like, Sherry, she's got to be talking to somebody. She's got to be talking to herself. She's got to be talking to a younger version of herself. She's got to be talking to a ghost. She's got to be talking to her truck. She's got to be talking to somebody.
Talking to the radio.
Talking to this dog she has around all the time.
Does this really great, right? Like, Bumblebee doesn't have a voice, so he talks through his radio.
Yeah, he talks through his radio. So Sherry did this really amazing thing where she came back to our next book coaching session and she was like, she's going to talk to Charlie Chaplin. And I was like, wait, what? She was like, yeah, she's going to have an imaginary friend in Charlie Chaplin, and it fits with the character's backstory, and it's fantastic. The character is constantly having conversations with this imaginary friend who is her own version of Charlie Chaplin. It's really fantastic. So if you want to read somebody who's doing it in a fun way, go check out Sherry's books. They're really great. Okay, last question. Let's talk about the 26th.
The 26th.
Yeah, first let's give an outline. I'm going to give an outline. We kind of split our workshops in half. Like I take half, Laura takes half. We interweave those halves. It's not like, all right, listen to Jeff for 2 hours, now listen to Laura for 2 hours. We interweave. We don't just talk straight. We interweave those. But I'm going to take kind of what I'm covering and just give you a quick rundown. And then Laura's going to take what she's covering and give you a quick rundown. So I'm handling the writing portion of the scenes. And we're going to start with a blank page and talk about, we're going to challenge you to think about your scene as a empty black box with no light. And then thinking about what needs to come into that box. The reader's standing in this box with no light, all the lights are turned off. And then we're going to put things into that box. And we're going to ask what is absolutely necessary for the reader to have in that box to initially experience that scene. And what you need are characters exchanging emotions and expectations, but what you need are characters that are talking to each other, and you need a conflict that they're trying to solve. So we'll start there, and then we'll talk about how we move from that thing that like black box to actually like writing out a conversation, but staying solely focused on the character voices and removing all additional things. And then we'll talk about how you take that skeleton draft and you shift it into a fuller, what looks like the page of a novel, by breaking it into segments, like finding the segments of conversation and adding back in the prose and the texture that enhances the emotional drive of the scene. So when I started writing this way, my writing speed actually increased. I know it sounds weird because I'm going to make you do 2 drafts of a scene, but when I started writing this way, my writing speed went way up because I stopped screwing around with things that aren't necessary for your scene. I promise that if you don't write dialogue first, you are losing time in messing around with crap that you don't need to mess around with until later. And once you get the scene skeleton down in a conversation, that back end stuff is going to come so much faster because you've already got all of the skeleton down and you're not like worried about like the pacing of this scene and how fast things are moving, how slow they're moving. And oh my gosh, how long have I been describing this thing? Should I keep describing this thing? I don't know. So once you get the conversation down, the rest of it will just start to flow. That'll be half of the talk. Laura, you want to outline your section?
Yeah, and just because you're talking about 2 drafts of the same scene, but what I've heard you say before is that you started your writing journey with 2 drafts of the same scene, but as you've become proficient with this, sometimes you merge these 2 things into 1 draft.
Yeah, I don't do 2 drafts anymore.
Right.
This is what we're going to teach you is a way to write that you'll do for like, I did it for a book and a half, but I'm a slow learner sometimes. So I've seen people do it for like 3 scenes and they're like, oh, I got it. Because what we're going to show you how to write a dialogue centric scene, but it's an exercise to retrain your brain how to think about your scene. That's what we're doing. We're retraining your brain to think differently about what is a scene and how a scene unfolds.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So what are you talking about when it comes to editing?
So this, I would say, is really kind of like the basics of editing as it relates to the emotional impact that your piece has on your reader. So we're going to take that dialogue only scene and we're going to prep it for that second pass where Jeff's going to show you how to write texture. And we're going to talk about things like staying in the moment and understanding the emotional beats of your scene, understanding how pacing and balance impact your reader, thinking about where you're going to want to use punctuation. Sorry, not punctuation. That's a weird thing. Punctuation is a thing, but we won't talk about that there. Like body language and how it affects the scene. Because when you're going straight dialogue only, body language doesn't come into play because you just want the back and forth between the characters. But as you're getting ready to add that texture to the scene, you have to start thinking about the body language of the characters. And then to some extent, we'll talk a little bit about the difference between action in a scene and body language, because those 2 things do very different things for your reader. Action are the movements that are important to understanding what's happening in the scene. Body language are the action are the physical elements that convey emotion or communicate. So really understanding the differences between those 2 things can be a really important part. We'll also talk about like tips and tricks for seeing these things happen, things like color coding and drawing lines and where to put the lines. For those of you who are in the Slack channel, you'll kind of get the key behind why the editing prompts each week have the actions that are associated with them. So typically with the editing prompt, we start with reading our scene out loud, and then there's a tool to help you dissect your scene. pull this out, color code this, look at this. So we'll talk about the tips and tricks about why we do that and how it's helpful. So that'll be kind of like the first editing portion. And then the second editing portion, we're going to really focus on like the common mistakes that people make as they're moving from dialogue only. So balancing the dialogue, making sure that the words that you're saying have an emotional impact. I'm working with an author right now who has a fantastic story to tell. She's got these great, really dynamic characters, but her first draft of her scenes feel almost mundane, like they're going through the motions of these things. And then we'll talk about the scene and she'll be like, oh, no, that's really important because of this, or that's really important because of this. And I'm like, oh, that's great. I so want to know that. How do we convey that the character is feeling this so it doesn't feel like a mundane scene and we really bring to life these things? So really kind of focusing on that emotional impact is going to be really great. And then there are a couple other tips and tricks that we'll talk about: balancing voices, maintaining focus for the characters, and really like highlighting and elevating kind of the voices that you have and elevating your strengths so that you can build on the strengths to just kind of grow your skills.
Yeah. I think for what most excites me about writing dialogue first is that it makes your scenes feel very cinematic. Because, you know, whether we want to admit it or not, TV and movies have won the entertainment battle right now. So I know I hate to say that as a writer, but they beat us. So that's, your readers are likely consuming more television and visual stuff, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram. They're consuming more visuals than they are words on pages, and engaging their imagination with words on pages. The upside that we have is that we have a direct line to their imagination, whereas, you know, video stuff has a visual representation that then attaches to imagination. But that's another conversation for another time. So we win in the imagination war. At the same time, we have to speak the language their imagination's used to speaking. So and the you know, for all the visualization that happens in a movie and TV, it starts with a screenplay. And so this is going to feel a little like screenplay writing, without all the screenplay writing rules, but it's going to make your scene very cinematic in the end, which is great. All right, Laura, anything else you want to share?
I would just say that the thing that I'm most excited about the editing portion is that we're really going to talk about practical tips that you can apply today. So when we did the last conference about character voice, it's super impactful. It really focuses on how you create a character voice and how you apply it to your writing. But it's sort of this big, grand idea that you use as you're creating this. When we're talking about editing, this is going to be super practical. Take this part of the page, look at these things, adjust these things, and you'll see how your piece is different. So that if you're really looking for the immediacy of impact on your writing, that's what I'm most excited about this conference. Whereas the last conference, I was really excited about like the creativity of it.
Mm-hmm.
This is more a practical guide as opposed to a like theoretical.
Nice.
So. And, you know, I'm all about the destination. So the faster we can get somewhere, the better off we're going to be.
Better off it is. Yeah. So go to dialoggedoctor.com, find the workshops 2022 menu item, click there and come sign up. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to have a good time. We got, it's going to be a good crowd. Yeah. So Laura, thanks for hanging with me.
Yeah.
After spending all day with me in the office. Coming back onto the podcast for an hour and a half. And then how much Jeff is too much Jeff?
At 8:30 tomorrow morning for work again.
That's right. We'll be right back. in the video shoot at 8:30 tomorrow morning.
Yep.
Yeah, wrestling with words to get an actor to help empower an actor to bring the character to life. Yeah, let's not wax about that as well. Jeff has more philosophical thoughts. All right. I'm going to turn off the recording before I say something else, Stephen. Bye.